Okay, I'll start it right now and see what hello everyone. Hope you can hear me. This is Mike Carberry with the Nuclear Free Team of the Sierra Club. I've started the webinar. It is recording. We're going to wait a few minutes. We've got about 25 people in the room so far, but it's still not even at the top of the hour. I've got about 3 minutes before the hour, and we will wait till a few minutes after the hour because it takes usually people a few minutes to log on. So um, excited to have you all on here. I hope you've all been able to watch the movie. If you'd like to watch the movie, you'll be able to get on and watch it till midnight tonight Eastern time. And we've been joined by one of our tech people. Hi, Don. And it's good to have you with us. I think we're doing really good so far. Got about 35 people in the room, and we're excited for everybody to join us. Again, I'm Mike Carberry. I'm co-chair of the Nuclear Free Team of the Sierra Club. You are, just to make sure you're on the right flight, this is the Atomic Bamboozle discussion panel. Atomic Bamboozle, the false promise of the nuclear renaissance. And it certainly is a false promise. So we're building a crowd now. We've got about 40 people in the room. And we'll get going a couple minutes after the hour. I've got right now right up just about straight up at the top of the hour. We will wait about 3 minutes longer. And we've got we'll start to put our I'll ask people as we go along to put questions in the Q&A box. I believe we have the chat disabled to prevent Zoom bombs, because we've had that before. And we will have a nice discussion, probably 90 minutes or so. If you have discussion topics you'd like us to discuss that we haven't gotten to, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them. Anonymous, how can we access the film? Somebody is typing the answer right now. If you did not, you could probably go to Atomic Bamboozle website. Jan, can you drop in the Q&A box the website URL, and for people to to go to the Q&A box, type that in there, and then we'll people and that will be open. We'll be able to have the link that's open for free viewing till midnight tonight. It's only about a 48-minute film, and so after this discussion, you'll still have time to watch the movie. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth it. I watched it again today. And so I think it's well worth it. So I just really have straight up a top of the hour, and we're going to wait about 3 more minutes before we get started. Again, I'm Mike Carberry. I'm the co-chair of the Nuclear Free Team of the Sierra Club. This is the panel discussion for the film Atomic Bamboozle, the false promise of the nuclear renaissance. It's a film by Jan Hocken, and Jan will be joining us, as will Kathy Sampson Cruzy, MV Romana, David Sissel, and Mark Z. Jacobson. So should have a lively discussion, and we're going to get started here in just a few minutes. So please hang with us. We've got a couple other questions in the Q&A box. And so the film is viewable until 12 Eastern. That is correct, 12 midnight. And so if somebody would drop the URL into now that Jan, that's you put that in the chat. You put that in the Q&A box, because the chat is only available to the the panelists and the moderators, so.
I,
Because we've
I put in
disabled
the
that for
answers.
we've disabled that for the public, so maybe somebody else can grab that.
I
And
did.
okay, thank you, Don.
Yeah. And it's till 11:59.
Yep, appreciate that.
Yep.
Answered, so real good. Thanks, everybody. And so if you go to atomicbamboozle.com, we should be able to get the yes, and we will be, the panel discussion will be archived and available later. Yes, it will be, and we will be sending out, this is actually the third film in our series. We also showed SOS, the San Onofre syndrome, and we showed also the Women of 3 Mile Island. And those have all been recorded, but probably haven't been adequately distributed. So we will, if you've registered or seen any of those films, we will get those out to, and if you've registered for any of the films, any of the panels, you will get the recording of all three of them. So I currently have about 3 minutes after the hour. We've got about 80 people in the room. So let's see. I think, and are we recording? Pause, stop recording. We are recording. So I think I'm going to start. I'm going to get a drink of water before I do that. So welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Carberry. I am the co-chair, along with Don Safer, of the Sierra Club's Nuclear Free campaign. And we have started all this year. We've been running a free online series of nuclear free nuclear films in the series. We started with the Women of 3 Mile Island. We followed that up with SOS, the San Onofre syndrome, and then we have finished it with Atomic Bamboozle, the false promise of the nuclear renaissance. And we're here this evening to talk about that film and to talk about nuclear power in general. And really, the subtitle of this and the title itself, Atomic Bamboozle. It really is. Nuclear power is a bamboozle, and it is a false promise. The nuclear renaissance has been a false promise from the get-go, and we really want to talk about it and how it has been. So joining us tonight, I'm going to briefly tell you who's joined us, and then we'll go through and hear from each of our panelists, and they will introduce themselves and talk about the film and give us their general thoughts. And then we're going to have an open and lively discussion among our panelists. So joining us tonight are the documentary filmmaker, Jan Hawken, and she's a PhD, professor emeritus of psychology at Portland State University, and the director of Atomic Bamboozle, and the director of a lot of other films. And Jan has recently joined our group, our core group of the Sierra Club's Nuclear Free core team, and we're so glad to have her. We also have Kathy Sampson Cruzy, who is a retired social worker, and she's with the Confederate Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. And she is also the associate producer of Atomic Bamboozle. We're also joined by Professor M.V. Ramana, um, and he is a professor of public policy and global affairs at the University of British Columbia. And he's the author of Nuclear is Not the Solution, the Folly of Atomic Power, the Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change. Happen to have a copy of that book right here, and I don't know if I can get it into. It certainly didn't come into focus there, but he will get it into focus here as we speak later. We're also joined this evening by David Slissel, who's the director of resource planning analysis for the Institute for Energy Economics and Policy Analysis, and is a foremost expert on economic and pricing, especially when it comes to nuclear power. And then, last but not least, is Mark Z. Jacobson, a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, and the author of No Miracles Needed: how today's technology can save our climate and clear our air. So those are the five panelists that are joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to flip the microphone over to Jan Hawken. And Jan, tell us about the movie, why you made it, and tell us a little bit more about yourself, and get us started. Thank you, Jan.
Well, it's delightful to be part of the series and supporting this effort at Sierra Club to do a broader, more robust education around nuclear power and the fantasies that this dream machine continues to produce. You might wonder what a psychologist has to contribute to thinking about this issue. And the more I looked into it and was encouraged to take on this project by Kathy Sampson Cruza as a feature film, the more I came to realize that psychology does have a lot to do with how this industry and the entrepreneurial hustlers and the technological fetishism that this industry is promoted, appealing to people's fantasies and in many cases kind of irrational hopes and dreams for the way out of the climate crisis really were kind of in my lane. I'm basically an educator, so I think of my documentary films as an extension of the classroom, a way of using the medium of the documentary to create spaces for people to think more deeply about issues than they ordinarily might. The title of the film, Atomic Bamboozle, I'd like to credit Peter Bradford, who was formerly with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And during my research for the film, I came across a quote of his saying, "I cannot believe how much politicians have been bamboozled by this industry and their promotion of these small modular reactors." And so I thought, yeah, that's a good title. But it took me into looking further, as I always do with my documentaries, into how this industry is promoted a vision of the climate crisis and offered nuclear power and this repackaging of old technologies in these kind of promoting it as something new and bold and really appealing to people's rational and very real fears about the climate emergency. But we also live in a country where people are sold a lot of false solutions and are particularly vulnerable in a state of crisis to sales pitches of various kinds. And so I began to, as I sometimes say, put nuclear power on the couch and look at how are they doing this? Because the more I looked into it in my research on the topic, the more I realized how there isn't a lot there. And yet the internet is flooded with these excited videos promoting these small modular reactors as safe, clean, and the wave of the future. And one way they've promoted this is playing on intergenerational dynamics, a theme that I've taken up in other documentaries as well, how an older generation of activists are described as being not really up with the times, that old anti-nuclear activists are radiophobic, they don't really understand how technology works. And they put a lot of money, the industry and our government, into what's called millennials for nuclear. So you see these ads, and in the film, we kind of analyze those ads, how this industry has promoted itself and appealing to the sense of young people that technological entrepreneurs, even if they haven't figured things out yet, they surely will down the road. And they've really downplayed or ignored or outright dismissed the concerns that abound around this industry. And one of the dilemmas that I tracked in the film and have have been particularly interested in is how they've dealt with the death and the destruction as part of the industry's history, the graveyard of problems. Hanford Nuclear Reservation and the history there is one tragic example, and how these wastes, some of these wastes are with us for some up to 100, 200,000 years, a number that is so big that people can't get their mind around it. It's almost a meaningless number because it's so big. So how do you help people get their mind around something like that? And so I really wanted to also distill a lot of the happy talk and tech talk that floods people in their promotional videos, where you have to kind of accept all of the technical talk because most lay people can't understand where they're going, are not prepared to follow the technological maneuvering in promoting these products. So I wanted to really distill out for the dilemmas and the controversies for issues. And Ramana, who I met while I was a visiting professor at University of British Columbia, he was so compelling in being able to distill these 4 issues: costs, waste, accidents, and proliferation, to cut through a lot of the dancing around the problems that is a habit of this industry. And it confuses people, particularly if you have people that seem to dazzle people with this these fetishized technological images. So I also wanted to pay tribute to the history of anti-nuclear activists that have been so dismissed by the industry, and to bring that history into the present. They're not this, we don't have the same problems exactly today, but yet there's much to be learned from the history of anti-nuclear activism and the many tactics that have been creatively deployed to take on the industry, including here in Oregon with the successful closure of the plant. But as we've seen in so many cases here and San Onofre syndrome, closing a plant is not the end of the story. There's still a lot of very complicated problems, what you do with these wastes. So I was so delighted to have Kathy Sampson-Cruza with this project, who was a guiding force behind it and bringing an environmental justice lens to this whole issue of nuclear that tends to be sidelined in the environmental justice movement. So thanks so much for having me on the panel tonight and for featuring the film.
Well, that's thank you, Jan, and the great thoughts about why you did the movie and how you did the movie, and that environmental justice tacks right into our next speaker, and that'll be Kathy. Kathy, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your history and in nuclear activism and how you got involved with Jan in the movie, and tell us a little bit more? Thank you.
Sheikh Clawat, good evening. My native name is Wayausuks. It's now Old Wayausuks. I'm a member of the Walla Walla tribe. The true name is Walulapum, of the federally recognized tribes of the Umatilla. We're way up in the eastern Oregon, the mouth of the Umatilla rivers, Walla Walla and the Snake. It's where the first big Walla Walla Treaty Council was held, when all the tribes came together to try to make peace with the governments that were forcing our people to stop war. And actually where Hanford is at, and where Richland is at, Columbia Point, was promised to our people, was promised to the headman. And those treaties, of course, were never fulfilled, those treaty promises. And as many of you may know, in the Constitution, it says very clearly that the treaties with the people who's rightfully this part of the continent belong to is the supreme law of the land. And of course, not far from those written words is the words that we are savages. So when you look at the way we have been treated since colonial powers came here, it's always been of a mistrust and what can be taken. So we don't learn those things in history books. We learn those things from when we're old enough to listen to our elders. And those are always balanced with, of course, how are we going to get through the school system that is a dominant English school system. So sometimes it's somewhat of a miracle that, quote, miracle that many of us even make it through high school and on to college, and who knows, to some degree, that I even got through to a master's. My history is not in sciences, although earth biology was wonderful and life sciences. That was really my brother's specialty as a fish biologist. And many times my parents would sit us down with the elders and tell us as young people to be sure and listen. And we sat around the longhouse and tried to pay attention, but we knew at the same time, if we didn't get the grades to graduate, that those same elders would sit us at the longhouse and say, you need to come home because we need you to read the fine print in what these people are putting before us and wanting us to sign. And those people would usually be the hired help, those lawyers that they were asking, this is what's right. This is what council should sign. And I'm telling you this because many times those interpretations of what was being said was, was they were in the back pocket of someone from Union Pacific or someone that was going to sell our treaty rights, out from under us. So many of us that were lucky enough to graduate high school, to make it off the reservation long enough to go to college, raise a family, and get back home, knew about the injustices that were happening. While I was at Portland State, I went to several rallies, and one of them was with Oregon Peace Works. And I went home and I said, this Hanford stuff is not good. And Lloyd Marbett was kind enough to come out to our reservation, have a meeting, and brought some of his colleagues. And we went to a rally at Hanford and we began to speak and we began to open up and understand. And, that leads to one thing to another. Part of the fish wars were going on. Nisqually was happening. There was so much happening around Indian country, as we would say. You could put a map on the wall and throw a dart and something was happening in Indian country. If it was an Indian child welfare law, if it wasn't something around federal Indian boarding school atrocities, something within the Catholic Church, violence against murdered and missing Indigenous women and children. something was always happening. There was a cause that was happening. Our plate was always full, and there was still more to do. So why I tell you this while also being married and raising a family is that sometimes things come full circle. I went to Alaska for a while. I saw the bountifulness of what the Native people had there. It was beautiful. I literally heard the stories of my elders saying that a long time ago, you could walk across the backs of salmon in the Umatilla River. My brother helped restore part of the salmon coming back to the Umatilla River. It was, people were in joy, people were, crying because that happened. And when I saw that, and my soon-to-be husband and I pulled out 99 salmon out of a set net. It was like just unbelievable. And then you see what's happening now to the Columbia River. You see what's happened, the tributaries. You see what's happened to the Snake River. Why is that happening? It's because the river is telling us that she's dying. And the lifeblood, as we've all said for many generations, Fukushima Daiichi, the water, the irradiated water coming this way, all that lives there. It's just this continuous life cycle that we all depend on. And then we talk about Hanford, and small modular nuclear reactors raise this seed of ugliness again. I just continue to say we have to continue to rise up and say that we are going to continue to fight this. And we might be getting old, as I just celebrated my 70th birthday, but we plant the seeds of that resistance, and we will continue to do that. So people like Jan use the means that they have. Sierra Club uses the means that they have. Columbia River Keeper and the people on this panel use the means that they have to keep spreading the good word to stop it. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy. That's a great story, and I'm just so appalled by some of the things that we have done to the First Nations over the years, and I'm fascinated by the history of the West, but I'm also appalled. But I never seem to be stop being appalled by the inhumanity that the white man has shown the natives of this country. We'll move on next to Ramana. Ramana, tell us a little bit more. I watched the movie again today. You were a big part of the film. Tell us about your part in the film. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about your book. Take it away, Ramana.
Thank you, Mike. And also thank you to Elder Kathy for those really wise words. It's makes one really thoughtful and wondering how one can do the best one can. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. The Musqueam have called this area home for thousands and thousands of years, and I'm privileged to be able to live and work on their lands. I'd like to start by actually observing that Jan's making of this film should be completely unnecessary. Sierra Club shouldn't have to be doing this series. The problems associated with nuclear energy are known for decades and decades, right? 30 years ago, if somebody had come and said nuclear energy is a clean, environmentally friendly source of power, they would probably be laughed out of the room, and rightfully so. It's a really sad reality that we now have a whole bunch of people, partly funded by the industry, partly by just what they are, I mean, people trying to grasp at whatever straws they can find in the face of the climate crisis, thinking about nuclear energy as a possible solution. And that those trying to remind people about why nuclear energy is undesirable, why it's such a problematic source of energy, is one of the reasons I wrote the book I did. Mike mentioned it earlier, and it's this book again. And so the book, when I started writing the book, my initial excuse me, my initial inclination was to not even talk about all of these problems. They were so well known, I figured there was no point in saying it again and again. And it was, I have to credit my editor for pointing out that, maybe I'm just living in this bubble inside my own head, but there's a new generation of people who seem to be really convinced that nuclear energy is the answer, and you need to rehearse all of that. But the real fundamental question that prompted my thinking about writing a book was to ask why, knowing what we know about nuclear energy, why do corporations and governments invest all this money, put in all this effort to try and keep this industry afloat? And I try to sort of elaborate that in the book. I'm not going to go into that right now, but just to say that I think there are, very briefly, I'd say there are a number of ways in which these private corporations profit from the nuclear enterprise. They pocket all the profits that they can make while socializing all of the costs and the risks on the public, right? Wherever we see nuclear plants being built, they are always the recipients of public funding in one way or the other. The reactors which have been constructed in the United States in the last couple of decades in South Carolina and in Georgia, both of them have they found legislative ways of passing on the cost of the reactor construction projects to the customers in that state, well before the reactor was constructed and the electricity was, they were benefiting from the electricity in any way, right? And in the case of South Carolina, the reactor was never constructed. For those of you who don't know, in South Carolina, there were two AP1000 reactors that were to be built in the VC Summer project. And that project cost over $9 billion. It was increasing in cost. Finally, the utilities involved in that canceled the project. But the people of South Carolina are still paying for that. And they will continue to pay for that for a long time, because all the entities that had loaned money to the project have it in their contract that they will be repaid. And that repayment will take a long period of time. So there are a number of ways in which corporations benefit. The other ways could be to do with how they try to take money from the funds that have been set aside for decommissioning reactors. And then there's a whole amount of money that can probably be made out of plans for managing the radioactive waste that all nuclear reactors produce. So, so there's a kind of interest there on the part of many, many companies to keep this going. And to all of these, what, when you point out the history of all these failures, what they get back to you, what they say is, well, that's all a thing of the past. We now have a new generation of reactors. They could be large reactors like the AP1000s, or they could be small, the so-called small modular nuclear reactors. They could be what are called advanced reactors. These are all just buzzwords. They don't really mean very much when you look down at it. And what is more important, none of these reactor designs will actually solve any of the four problems that Jan mentioned: the high costs, the production of radioactive waste, the risk of catastrophic accidents, and the inextricable link to the possible proliferation of nuclear weapons. And SMRs and advanced reactors and all of those things they all have to operate ultimately as nuclear reactors, and nuclear reactors have to obey the laws of physics because they produce energy through the nuclear fission process, and they use that heat to the heat from the nuclear fission process to boil water. That's ultimately what a nuclear reactor is. And because of the physics of the process, there is no way for a nuclear reactor to not produce radioactive waste. There is no way for it to not produce plutonium that can be used to make nuclear weapons. And all reactors are such complex entities that there are always going to be chances of accidents. And last but not least, because a nuclear reactor has all of these properties, in particular the fact that it produces these radioactive substances which have to be kept away from people, a nuclear power plant will always be expensive. You cannot make a cheap nuclear plant. It is just inherent to the properties of the system. And it does not matter whether these reactors are some small modular reactors, advanced reactors, or that, for example, they are being funded by billionaires, whether it is Bill Gates or Sam Altman or Peter Thiel. It doesn't matter because all of these properties are inherent to nuclear power. And so I think we all have to keep doing our bit, as Elder Kathy said, to keep making sure that this boondoggle, this bamboozling cannot continue in the way it is doing. And I really thank Jan for making this film, and it was my privilege to be part of it. And to Sierra Club to invite me to be part of this panel, and for doing all the great work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramana. When I think of a bamboozle, I always think of a kind of an economic bamboozle. And when I think of economics and nuclear power, I think of David Slissel to set me straight. And so, David, can you help us out a little bit about an economic atomic bamboozle? Thank you, David. I think you're muted.
Let me start by thanking you and the club for inviting me to be with such distinguished co-panelists. I first became involved in nuclear issues over 50 years ago from the perspective of a consumer advocate. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, was the staff attorney for a group called the Georgia Power Project. And we were seeing major rate increases from the Georgia Power Company to build the first generation of nuclear plants in the US. Since then, my work has taken me through the history of nuclear power that Jan discusses in the film. A history of multi-billion-dollar cost overruns, multi-year delays. And today we see the nuclear industry and the US government, particularly the Department of Energy, trying to convince the public that that's all in the past, as Ramana said. But that's not true. We're already seeing sharp increases and significant delays in the new generation of nuclear power plants. And I'll be happy to participate in the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, David, for joining us. And that brings us to Mark, Professor Mark C. Jacobson. Mark, thanks for joining us, probably from somewhere close to Stanford University. Thanks, Mark. How
Yeah.
you doing today?
Thanks for having me on. So, yeah, I just want to say a few things about nuclear. I mean, you hear a lot of proposals to push nuclear, and there are a lot of lobbyists, and yet there's less nuclear output worldwide in 2023 than there was in 2005 or 6 or 7. Meanwhile, you have other technologies like even hydropower. You don't hear about hydropower lobbyists, but there was a similar amount of hydropower in 2005 as nuclear, but there's 60% more hydropower today than there is nuclear power today in 2023 in any case. And the point is, there's just a huge lobbying push for completely useless technology going forward. I mean, all you hear about is more money going into nuclear power, small modular reactors, subsidies for keeping existing reactors open, even reopening dead reactors that have been closed down. And for what is just to funnel money and subsidies to lobbyists and people who are just pushing this useless technology, when there are actually lots of other technologies that are making a huge amount of progress, specifically solar and wind. I mean, this year alone, the world is going to produce about 590 gigawatts of solar in nameplate capacity. If one nuclear reactor is about 1 gigawatt of nameplate capacity, so in 1 year, the world is going to add almost 600 nuclear reactors in terms of peak capacity, and that's going to add 25% to the total amount of solar. So there'll be closer to 2 terawatts of nameplate capacity of solar, and wind is similarly growing. The two cheapest forms of electricity, according to IRENA, they just did a world average of electricity generating technologies. The two cheapest forms are wind, 67% less expensive than fossil fuels, and solar, utility scale solar, 56% less than fossil fuels. But offshore wind, even that's onshore wind, is 67% less. Even offshore wind is about 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour, is about 25% less than fossil fuels. Geothermal and hydro are also less than fossil fuels. So all the main clean renewable energy sources are all cheaper than fossil fuels. What's more expensive than fossil fuels? Well, nuclear power. So, it takes now in North America and Europe 17 to 23 years between planning and operation of a new nuclear reactor. That's based on all the plants that there was one in North America, the Vogtle plants, or one plant, 2 reactors that have been built in the last 30 years. And those took 17 and 18 years. The plant in Finland took 23 years. The Hinkley plant in England is scheduled to take 22 to 23 years. Flamanville, France, it's still near 20 right now. And there's no plant in North America or Europe that's less than 17 years. Worldwide, that's between 12 and 23 years. We have 6 years to solve 80% of the climate problem. So we do not have time to wait around for these technologies that can't even be built in a sufficient amount of time. Small modular reactors are no better. Even prototypes aren't even planned to be available until 2020, 2030, 2031 or so. And that's just an estimated date, and that's not commercialization. And again, there's no reason to think those are not going to take 12 to 23 years between planning and operation. What's the cost of these new reactors? Most of them in Europe and in the Hinkley plant in the US, the Vogtle plant in the US, are on the order of $15, $16 a watt, compared with about $0.8 a watt for new utility scale solar. So just based on cost alone, why would you wait 15 years longer? It takes maybe 1 to 3 years to put up new solar PV at the utility scale. Why would you wait 15 years longer and spend like 20 times more per watt and about 5 to 7 times per kilowatt hour of electricity for the same technology? Just makes no sense whatsoever. In addition to the other problems mentioned, waste issues, weapons proliferation issues, meltdown risk, there's underground uranium mining risk, and nuclear is not carbon free as claimed. It emits 9 to 37 times the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions as wind. And half of that's due to this fact that you have to wait around so long for it to be built, that you're emitting all sorts of emissions during that time. And the other half is a combination of construction, the energy used to mine, transport, and refine uranium, and also you also have heat emissions directly from the reactor and water vapor emissions, which is a greenhouse gas. Those contribute small amounts to the global warming impact of nuclear power. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, you packed a lot in there, Mark. That's a lot. Maybe we can unpack a little bit of that. Climate change solution. Let's kind of unpack that a little bit about nuclear power not being a climate change solution. we need to get to where we need to go by 2030. I've always called these small modular reactors unicorn reactors because you're just as likely to see a unicorn as you are a small modular reactor by 2030. David, maybe you can tell us what happened to UAMPS, the TVA proposals, those sorts of things. Where are we with these new small modular reactor proposals, or Ramana or anybody else? Where are these new proposed SMRs? Where are the current projects? Where are they, and how soon are we going to see one, if at all? Who would like to take that?
Simple, too slow and too expensive.
Mhm.
As Mark just explained, they won't be available in time, in the time the world needs new resources, generating resources available.
Mark, I've given away about a dozen copy of your books, No Miracles Needed, including to a lot of the upper management at the Sierra Club about the answer is we already have the answers that we need: solar, wind, and storage, right? So why, when and I've been into the utility business for 25 years. It took me only a couple years to figure out that utilities are not in the business of making power unless you're talking about political power, that they're in the business of making profits. And where they make the most profits is on basically making investments in capital investments, and that's building stuff. And the most expensive thing that they can build is a nuclear power plant. And that's indeed why they want to build it, because they can make the most money if they can get a nuclear power approved, because it's done by their PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, which is a politically appointed board by the governor. And so if an investor-owned utility can get a nuclear power plant approved, then they can make the most money. So that's sort of why I've always thought that nuclear power was, they wanted to do it, is it's purely political and purely for greed and profit. Am I wrong?
Well, that's certainly the people building the reactors have a strong financial interest to get the reactors started, to get something in the ground. So because once they start, they can start delaying as much as they want and keep asking for more money. It's like an endless swimming pool of money that needs to be filled up over and over again. So, it's just ridiculous at this point to even contemplate new nuclear of any form. And there's no point, there's no reason. We have plenty of other energy sources that are safer, cleaner, and do not have all the problems associated with nuclear. So you have to question why people are proposing new nuclear. And I mean, the motivation is not pure, and there can't be, because either that or they're just not thinking straight anymore. Because the solutions are clear, and if we are concerned about climate, air pollution, energy security, we need to focus on real solutions and implement these solutions as quickly as possible. And nuclear is not the way to go in that case.
Ramana, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question about small modular reactors that you asked, and say we do have some experience. There's in the Western Hemisphere, there's one small modular reactor under construction that is in Argentina, the CAREM reactor. Construction started in 2014, and at that time, they said it will start operating by 2017 to 2018. It's now 2024, and the reactor is nowhere near start of operations. Right now, they're saying the expected date is 2028, but I doubt if that's going to happen either. There are two sets of two reactors, small reactors, operating in Russia and China, respectively. In Russia, there are floating power plants that are mounted on a barge, and those reactors were also delayed. They were supposed to be operating construction about 3 years. They took about 13 years, and again the costs also rose a lot. And there are two in China. They are high temperature gas cooled reactors. Again, the same story. They were delayed. They were more expensive. And what is more important about both of them is that the Russian and the Chinese plants, that they have not been operating at great efficiency. So the Russian capacity factors, this is the way we measure what is the amount of electricity they produce in proportion to what they could produce theoretically. The capacity factors for those plants are the order of about 30%, give or take. The ones in China, it started, it was declared commercial, but in the year after that, last year in 2023, the power level was lowered from 200 megawatts down to 150 megawatts. That is by a reduction by 25%. So clearly they're having some trouble. And if you look at how much electricity it has output, in the whole year, it output what it could have done in 1 month. Right. So that's a capacity factor of about 8.5%. So the experience so far with operating small modular reactors and SMRs under construction has been the same as other reactor projects.
Yeah, Jen.
I'd like to just share a bit about my experience showing Atomic Bamboozle now. I don't know, 40 or 50 screenings, often campuses with students, and in festivals. And often there's a moment, a kind of depressive, existential moment when when these young people say, maybe this is not such a good idea. But if it's not such a good idea, what are we really facing a big problem? And I don't think the answer, as important as it is, and Mark Jacobson, your work has been so important, saying, yes, there are other more rational, better technologies, proven technologies. But I also think it's a mistake to just feel like our whole argument depends on feeding this machine that is producing and requiring voracious amounts of energy. I think the 3 Mile Island pitch to reopen that reactor is to power AI and these massive amounts of electricity these industries require. And I remember when I became involved early on in the environmental movement, and Kathy Sampson Cruz has really emphasized this. We have to think about a saner world, about conservation. Do we really need all of these projected outputs? And I don't mean to sound like a Luddite, I know we need power, but I also think we have to be careful not to just accept the premise of projected power needs. Like, that is part of how a capitalist system operates. Endless growth, expansion, more and more and more. And I think Native people have some very important lessons on what these extractive industries have left in their wake, and we should really talk about conservation as well. I think, Kathy, you were
Yeah, jump in there, Kathy.
My question is to Mark. It's really nice to meet all of you, but Mark, so are there any other states that you know of? I'm not quite sure why I haven't researched this before, but are there any other states that you know of, like Oregon, that actually have a ban against nuclear power?
They have a ban. I don't know of any bans, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. But
There's
Yeah,
moratoriums.
I don't.
There
Why
are
couldn't I-
moratoriums.
Moratorium, yeah.
Yes, there's Illinois had a moratorium on building new ones. And but they're trying to repeal those moratoriums. And
I was
so
just thinking about that and how hard that was to get, and how, of course, they tried to repeal it in it 2019. Yeah, when we got together to rally against that. So my point is, Native peoples realized quite a long time ago, and I can't remember the year, to band together in what's called the National Congress of American Indians. And they got into regions, and our region is called the Affiliated Tribes, ATNI. And some wax and wane on how effective it is. But we got together with a group of folks and drafted a resolution in 2019 to say, and I want to say there's 56 tribes at that time in the Northwest. And I'm not a leader of any tribe. I'm just an old grandma, Kasla. And anyway, we drafted this resolution and got it with a leader to present it through the appropriate channels and got it passed. And that whereas said Oregon Senate Bill 444 at that time, and it's a very long resolution that says we support it. We do not want nuclear power. And still, just recently in our little neck of the woods of Eastern Oregon, I have the OPB article up because it hit Eastern Oregon pretty hard. The Umatilla County Commissioners, I'm looking at the article, last September, what was it, the 9th it came out, the 12th, something like that, was going to throw good money, $30,000 to this law firm. I think, where are they at? In Portland, probably. Some law firm to look at small modular reactors. They like to drop the N, right? They don't want to say nuclear out there. To look at they call it the what are they calling it? The thread the needle to pass state nuclear energy restrictions. You see that article, Mark? I mean, it's like they're gonna keep doing whatever they can do to try to, get on that false hope of whatever little mosquitoes in their ear.
So
Yet there
Kathy,
are neighbors.
That's true.
one of the
There are
things is,
neighbors that have no respect for what we're doing. So of course,
Yeah.
I sent an email to OPB guy. I'm like, hey, I'm a tribal member and I don't support that. And I got a hold of our tribal council people. And I said, hey, passed them the article. What's going on?
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. So that's what local, state kind of partnerships can and cannot do. Word's still out. We'll see.
Yeah.
That's
well,
all.
thank you, Kathy. One of the topics that's been brought up in the chat has been AI and data centers and crypto mining.
Oh, goodness.
And so we have an increasing demand for electricity. I mean, we're going through electrification, decarbonization, and Mark's research says that we can meet the need for electricity with solar, wind, and storage. But I've been told that an AI search uses 8 times more electricity than a regular Google search. Now, I'm not sure if that's true, but if it is, I've never found a Google search to be insufficient. And so why would I use 8 times more electricity for an AI search? And I certainly don't think I've ever found the utility for cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. And so I'm going to throw this out there as a jump ball for people to discuss cryptocurrency, data centers, AI, and to power them with nuclear power. Who wants to take that?
Well, I mean, I could just speak for California, like in this last year, what's really increasing electricity demand is heat waves, not so much AI. But actually the demand for electricity, even though temperatures this year were about 3 degrees higher in the summer, 3 degrees Fahrenheit higher than in the last year. And even though we have more electric vehicles, and even though we have more AI and more Bitcoin mining, electricity demand actually has been about constant or down. And the reason is because we've been adding a lot of rooftop solar, and rooftop solar reduces the demand for grid electricity. So this is really where we should be focusing our attention, is to put solar on everybody's rooftop, reduce the demand for grid electricity, reduce the need for transmission lines, reduce the need for utility scale electricity generation and transmission lines, and the reduced transmission sparks, which reduces wildfires. The Hawaii fires, California fires have been sparked by transmission lines. And So really, the solution is to put a lot of rooftop solar. So meanwhile, while PG&E is like trying to, pushing to keep Diablo Canyon open, or at least not trying to shut it, they also tried to reduce the amount of new rooftop solar by changing the net metering law. So we have utilities working against real solutions as well.
Right.
And that's the solution also for this alleged AI increases of, as you say, how many, that's just the hypothetical whether that's going to increase or not. We will need more demand as we get off transportation based on oil, get off on industrial heat based on coal and oil and gas. We're going to need twice as much electricity to get rid of all fossil fuels. So overall energy demand, though, will go down about 55 to 60%. We'll double electricity demand, but that's more efficient. That's a more efficient system. But that we can power all that electricity with just clean renewable energy. We do not need nuclear. And so there's no point in reopening old nuclear reactors for this.
Yeah, I've always found in my 25 years that utilities will always fight anything that takes money out of their pocket, like energy efficiency and distributed generation. If they're making the money, they like it. If just rooftop solar, they don't make the money. Which brings up you talked about reopening nuclear power plants. We in the industry we've been calling them zombie plants, like Palisades in Michigan. And of course, 3 Mile Island, they're going to reopen one of the, I guess, one of the reactors. Bill Gates and Microsoft wants to open one of the reactors that wasn't damaged during the 1979 meltdown at 3 Mile Island. Anybody want to talk about zombie reactors?
Well,
David?
there's only a limited number of reactors that they can bring back to life. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, Crystal River in Florida, for example, that have started to be decommissioned. It's really unlikely that those reactors, so it's really a limited pot of zombie reactors. I think that what will happen, well, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, right now, Microsoft is planning to buy TMI-1 and planning to restart it. We'll see how well that goes. We'll see what the price of electricity is in 5 years, 10 years. And they're paying for this old nuke to keep running. They may not be real happy. Even Gates, with all his money, may not be happy paying the price.
So why wouldn't Bill Gates? This is a question that is often asked. One of the richest men in the world, Bill Gates, if he wants nuclear power, he has his own SMR company, and now he wants to open 3 Mile Island. Why doesn't he use his own money, David?
Because he thinks he's a genius. He thinks that because he started Microsoft, he's smart. He's the smartest guy. Forget the room. He's the smartest guy in the world. And so he pursues all of these topics that he should just keep his mouth and money out of. And
yeah, I didn't.
That's basically it. We referred to the reactor in Wyoming, the Natrium,
Yes,
as the Bill Gates reactor.
right.
I mean, I don't understand why anybody would buy the line on a nuclear power plant from somebody who made his money selling software that didn't work at first. I mean, people forget about all the problems with the beta and et cetera, versions of Windows that had to be redone. So,
Well, didn't somebody say that trying to solve a problem with the same mindset that got you into the problem is the definition of insanity? Is that and Bill Gates, I think he had a book about how using technology to get us out of our basically climate change problem is basically the antithesis of your book, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, well, in fact, that's where I got the title from, because he kept saying we need a miracle technology.
Direct air capture. Well, listen, we've had a lot of questions in the chat in the Q&A, and I'm going to bring on Don Safer. Don, do we have any really good questions that we can throw out to the panel here?
Oh, there's been a bunch of great questions, and
Any
I
that
don't
are
know.
pressing?
I don't know if the panelists have been seeing them, but I've been responding to them. I don't even really know where they're going, the responses, but I think there's been a lot of questions about the power of money and the political, or the one question about the power of money in the political campaigns, campaign finance reform, but that relationship between money and the nuclear industry. And I guess I would throw in the military as well, just combine the questions about the military. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that one on.
Oh, that's a big one.
Then you start, Kathy.
The military industrial complex. Oh, who will knock at my door?
Uh, I think the original speech had military industrial congressional complex. And well, that was in the original speech, and then it was the congressional was taken out, but it really should have been left in. Yeah, so let's talk about proliferation, and let's talk about nuclear and how it's tied to nuclear warfare. Anybody want to talk
My
about that?
suggestion would be to read Winona LaDuke's book.
Okay. We always like to read more books. Anybody else want to, Ramana, you want to, you cover part of this in your book?
Sure, I can say a little bit. I think, the nuclear power industry is intrinsically tied to the capacity to make nuclear weapons. There are sort of 5 different kinds of connections I talk about. So there's a historical connection. All of many of the first nuclear reactors around the world were built, including the one in Hanford, to make plutonium to make nuclear weapons. And this is the technology that was then subsequently used to generate electricity. There's a geographical overlap. If you look at all the nuclear reactors around the world, there are roughly around a little over 400 reactors that are operating. The majority of them are in countries with nuclear weapons, whether it's United States or France or China or UK, India, and so on. And then but if you include also the countries like Canada, where I live, which is allied with a nuclear weapon state, namely the United States, through a military alliance, then that overlap is completely overwhelming, right? So there's a huge sort of geographical overlap. I mean, the technology for both of them are very related because all nuclear reactors require enriched uranium, especially the light water reactors and some of the advanced reactors. They all require some amount of enrichment, and the same enrichment technology is what allows you to enrich uranium to make weapons grade uranium, the kind that was used, for example, in the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And all nuclear reactors produce plutonium. And if you set up a system by which the plutonium can be extracted from the spent fuel through this chemical process called reprocessing, then the plutonium could in principle be used to make nuclear weapons. And then there are 2 other connections which don't come to people's mind off the top of their head. One is the fact that when you train people to design and operate nuclear reactors in any country, you are also creating the capacity in that country to be able for these people to go off and design nuclear weapons or some aspect of those. There's some overlap. It's not identical, but the fact is a country that has nuclear power plants is ahead of a country that doesn't have any nuclear power plants when it comes to capacity to make nuclear weapons. And the last thing which one should remember is, especially in a place like United States, the institutions that promote nuclear energy are the same that also oversee nuclear weapons materials. So in the United States, that's the Department of Energy, which is in charge of both the nuclear weapons materials and promoting nuclear power. In India, it's the Department of Atomic Energy, and so on and so forth. So these are all overlaps which you really cannot get out of. And this is one reason why many countries do support nuclear power. Typically, the nuclear energy industry tries to distance itself from nuclear weapons. They say, oh, there's no connection, don't try to mix it up, except when they have financial trouble. So once their reactors get into trouble, they go and say, well, the government should subsidize us. precisely because we are linked to the military, right? So in the United States, it's usually through the nuclear navy. In the UK, it was through the capacity to make the Trident nuclear submarine. So
Excellent. Thank you. Great answer. Don, let's go
Yeah,
around
there's
two.
another question in terms of the federal subsidies. We're all seeing the charm offense of that the Department of Energy and the industry are doing to rebrand nuclear. And it brings to mind, if any, or it brings up the question of the amount of federal subsidies that are going into nuclear at the current time. And I don't know if any of the panelists has a running number, starting with the Manhattan Project, how much money has been put into this industry. It might be the subject of a research project, but it's enormous amounts of money. I don't know if anybody can speak to at least the current initiatives from the federal government of how much is going into subsidizing this industry.
Don, it depends on what you count. So, the nuclear weapons and the associated systems, there was an audit of that done in the 1990s by the Brookings Institution, and they calculated in the trillions of dollars. But that includes not just the reactors to make the materials, but all of the other systems that are required to make nuclear weapons. In terms of nuclear energy, I think there are some numbers from the OECD, and they typically run into the hundreds of billions, I think. It's probably what I would imagine.
I did see one report, Don, that of, I believe, the $369 billion that was in the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's climate that was addressing climate change, that over half of that was available to nuclear power. So that amounts to a couple $100 billion available to nuclear power. And of course, our government is trying to be, they don't want to pick winners and losers. So unfortunately, they're not listening to Mark Jacobson, and they are choosing some of these miracle solutions like direct air capture and carbon capture pipelines and ethanol and some of the other things that they really should be choosing winners and losers, because they're choosing a lot of things that are, to use another word that is my second favorite word that's very similar to bamboozle, they are choosing boondoggles, things that are absolutely worthless and wastes of money because they are false climate change solutions. Another question, Don. Yeah, I know there's a bunch of them in there. Pick a good one.
The insurance situation, the Price-Anderson Act, and the lack of coverage for a major accident.
I can say something. I mean, in all countries, there has been some kind of liability provision, primarily because the cost of an actual accident will vastly exceed the capacity of any private player to pay out. But there are in the United States, that is through the Price-Anderson Act, but in other countries there are similar things. The typical caps in those liabilities are far lower than the potential cost of an accident. If you take Fukushima, for instance, it runs in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and the caps in your typical liability provision is on the order of tens of billions of dollars.
Thanks.
I'll also add one more thing. I think the one thing which people may not recognize was that one reason why these liability provisions were considered to be very important was when the United States started exporting nuclear reactors in the 1960s. And they were very concerned, especially to Western Europe at that point, they were very concerned that if one of these countries were to import a US reactor design and there is an accident there, then they would sue, claim compensation. And the United States, all the reactor suppliers didn't want anything of that. So not only is there a cap on the liability, but there's also a provision by which the suppliers are indemnified from having to pay any compensation, right? All of the compensation has to be paid by the operator of the reactor. It's almost as though if you have a car and the car has a genetic problem, for example, the Toyotas had genetic problems. If you are in an accident, you're still liable for paying out rather than Toyota.
Another question has come up about the opportunity costs of nuclear. And so that's a big topic there.
Sorry, what's the question?
What are the opportunity costs or the lost opportunity costs of spending money on nuclear now in regard to climate change and addressing, actually lowering carbon emissions now?
Well, to give you an example, I mean, aside from the fact that it took like Vogel 17, there were 2 reactors, one took 17 years, the other took 18 years between planning and operation. And while they were waiting around, they put up and they added enough cement to these reactors to build a sidewalk from Miami to Seattle. So they put enough CO2 emissions in the air before a single kilowatt hour of electricity was generated. This huge amount of CO2 just from cement production, in addition to allowing fossil fuel plants to run in order to generate electricity, because if they had spent that money, it cost $35 billion in the end. If they'd spent that $35 billion up front on wind and solar, they could have gotten, instead of 2.2 gigawatts they could have gotten on the order of 30 to 35 gigawatts of wind and solar. Although the capacity factors are lower, this overall energy would have been much greater. So those plants would have been running within like, say, 3 years after they spent the money, instead of waiting 17 to 18 years. So they had an extra like 14, 15 years of emissions from the grid. That's an opportunity cost, plus all the emissions associated with this cement manufacturing. And, they're not going to pay off their carbon debt for maybe never, because it's going to take decades, first of all, to catch up with all the emissions they've allowed from all those fossil fuel plants that were running while we're waiting around for them. So that's just the start of it. In addition, they themselves emit water vapor and heat, and there's uranium mining associated with them that emit more emissions. So these are carbon positive. These are not, right now they're running, the reactors are still, they've already built up this huge carbon debt and air pollution debt that they may never pay off. So the whole thing that nuclear is zero carbon or carbon neutral is a lie. I mean, it's just not true. You just need to be honest when you're doing accounting about carbon and air pollution emissions, and nuclear puts out a huge amount of carbon and air pollution because of the long time it takes, and because it does result in emissions during its operation and construction.
So why do we, you were just talking about carbon free, how they promote it as carbon free. This might be a good question for you, Jan. Why do we allow the industry to get by with that huge lie that nuclear power is carbon free? Why are they allowed to? I mean, it's like they're President Trump and we don't check him on his lies. The nuclear industry and the renaissance, that for years they've been able to say that they're carbon free, and we know that they're not. Why are they allowed to get by with that?
Well, they've relied very heavily on what I call the fetishizing of technology. And a fetish from a psychological point of view is focusing on a dazzling, attractive, hypnotic object that blinds you to all of the other problems around it. So you fixate on this thing that provides you some pleasure or comfort when you're afraid, and are not able to attend to the surrounding problems in which it's embedded. So I think with the film, we tried to disembed the fetish, and show all of what's surrounds it, the whole supply chain, all of these factors that make it staggeringly expensive as well as irrational from
Right.
any reasonable accountant. And I think how you break through that and show that this is a fantasy object, and there's not really much behind the fantasy, but it's been sold like a lot of products are sold in this country. and with advertisers who are very good at domesticating it. They separate it from these old big phallic towers that are kind of hauntingly oppressive in their size. So they have these designs of small, slick, Lego-like prototypes with, sometimes they have skirts around them in the ads. So you pull back the skirts and there it is. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it also is about advertising and the vulnerability of people to this kind of technological fetishism.
We used to talk about the front end of nuclear power, the mining, the milling, and the enrichment of uranium, which unfortunately most of that is done on Native American lands. And all of those processes are very energy intensive and very polluting, especially to Native American lands, and have created huge wastelands. And there's entire movies dedicated and books dedicated to the wastelands that they have created on indigenous lands. And then, of course, there's the back end, the waste issues. And that's also, you know, when you start to think about how long is 500,000 years, and to conceive of that, and I start to tell people, well, you know, if you believe that Jesus Christ walked on this earth, that was only 2,000 years ago, you know, and we have to babysit this waste for 248,000 years plus 2,000, right? Or maybe sometimes they say some of that waste is 1,000,000 years that will be dangerous, and we can't even fathom that. And so it's just incredible how they get by with this lie that it's you know, only when the fission reaction happens and there's no CO2, but that's just a very narrow part of it, and they get by with that bullshit. So anybody else want to grab onto this and go? Ramana, Mark? Okay, Don, more questions.
I'll just say one thing. It's very similar to this carbon capture thing. It's like they look at, you know, carbon capture equipment will take carbon dioxide out of the air at the equipment, but it ignores all the emissions going on around it due to the extra energy needed for the carbon capture equipment, due to the fact that you need to build pipelines for it. You need energy for the pipelines. Then when you put it somewhere, 82% of it goes to enhanced oil recovery and 40% of that CO2 goes right back to the air. But all that is just ignored when you just look at the equipment itself.
Yeah. And did you see that in Illinois, the stuff that's sequestered is actually leaking? And when it
Yeah, through
leaks,
the pipes themselves.
yeah, well, the sequestered stuff is leaking into a lake, and that when the CO2 leaks into water, it forms carbonic acid.
Yeah.
Don, another question, please.
There have been several questions about the biological effects of radiation and how understudied it is, and a reference to the Bear 7 report. And so it's curious to me that there's been no studies done on the effects of having a nuclear facility, whether it's a reactor or the fuel facility in Irwin, Tennessee, which is now suffering from the flooding that you may have seen in the news. And we have asked if that nuclear fuel services facility and the nuclear waste processor have been affected by the flood. And the early answer is no, but you never can be sure. Anyway, the question really is about the health effects of the surrounding population, and you know, how come, in my mind, how come there are no studies that are current when we've got you should have a lot of data by now?
Anybody?
I'll say a little, yeah, I'll say a little bit. I think, you know, there is a lot of data. The broad consensus among the scientific community, especially at the in the National Academy of Sciences Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation panel, for example, is that radiation is harmful till the lowest possible levels. There is no threshold below which it is safe to be exposed to radiation. I think that's a fairly clear thing. That's something which the nuclear industry doesn't like. So they keep pushing ideas that, oh, below a certain level, we don't see any damage. There are even some crazy people who think it's actually good for you to get a very low level of radiation. But by and large, I don't think those things have been agreed. And there are studies which come out every now and then showing more and more sort of studies of workers exposed to radiation and how they have increased risks of cancers and also cardiac and other health effects. So I think the knowledge base is growing. It's what is being the reason it's being challenged to some extent is because the nuclear industry is really pushing very hard.
Yeah, and that their narrative is clean, safe, and cheap, Don. You know,
Right.
anything that would contradict that narrative, and a climate solution, right? Don't forget that,
Our viewers have written in a correction that the Illinois moratorium was lifted in 2023.
Yes.
And but that the California still has a moratorium. And so
We have
that's
some
a
smart
correction.
viewers. We have
And
smart viewers.
Kentucky had a moratorium because they're a coal state. And that was in danger of being lifted. It may have been lifted. I'm not up on the latest, but for a long time it wouldn't have been considered because of the power of the coal lobby in Kentucky. But
And the National Coal Mining Museum has solar panels on its roof, so there's hope. So,
yeah, another question came up on cooling water requirements and how, that in a changing climate of drought and flood, can anybody address that?
Well, I mean, over the last few years in summers, especially in Europe, there've been a lot of reactors shut down because of the temperature of the cooling water has been too high. So this has resulted, in addition to other reasons for shutdowns, like more maintenance requirements in much lower capacity factors of reactors, for example, in France. And but there are also shutdowns like in Belgium and in other countries in Europe. So yeah, with higher temperatures, we expect more shutdowns and so lower capacity factors of nuclear power. And that's another issue to deal with.
Here's another question on how to combat the narrative that we have successful small modular reactors in the nuclear navy. And so what's the big deal? We'll just use reactors like the Navy's been using for a long time now.
Well, two things. I have the greatest respect for the nuclear navy, but we don't know, they don't care about cost. I mean, and we don't know how much the nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers, we don't know what the cost of the reactor part of the nuclear part of it is. And secondly, we don't know what problems they've had. Clearly any problems that the nuclear navy has experienced are national security protected. So, I mean, in theory, it's a great idea, but in practice, it's probably not so hot. No pun intended.
Yeah, I mean, I think last week, didn't China's new nuclear submarine sink at the dock? And I think there's a US nuclear submarine crashed once a few years ago, and other ones of different countries have sunk or crashed. So we don't know what the impacts of those are, but I think the biggest issue is these are not commercial reactors, so it's not a comparable technology. I mean,
So-
if you have infinite amount of money to spend.
So
And
is it true that small modular reactors create more waste and more cost per unit of electricity than a larger, say, AP1000? Because they're not getting economies of scale? Can somebody address that?
Well, I mean, sorry, go on, Ramana.
I just said the answer is yes.
In theory, but other than the Chinese and Russian reactors, there are no SMRs operating. So we don't know what they will eventually cost. I mean, I'm not saying they'll be cheap. We don't know how high and how expensive they will be.
Okay. What, currently, is there a ballpark? I'm work mostly in solar and wind. And when people, I've actually worked on a project that's replaced Dwayne Arnold nuclear power plant that they closed down, contracted with NextEra Energy to replace all that with solar. And it was rated at about 600 megawatts, and we've already licensed 400 megawatts of solar. And a lot of the locals wanted us to reopen that, and in the press they've actually talked about it, but we've already relicensed 400 megawatts of the 600. So there, I mean, 400 of it is gone. So there's no way they could reopen it at its current, at its old license capacity factor. The only way they could do it was would probably be with an SMR. So it couldn't be a zombie reactor. So I've always tell people that nuclear power is about 8 times more expensive than wind and solar. Is that a pretty good ballpark figure? 8 times?
Well, per unit energy.
Yeah.
I would say there's a range. It's
Yeah.
probably like maybe 4 to 8 times.
4 to 8, okay.
Depends on
Yeah.
the very.
I don't like to get too specific, but 4 to 8, okay. I like to deal in ballpark figures. I'm a big baseball fan. Thank you.
So,
Don, go ahead.
Here's a question from a fan of grassroots organizing to change the world. What can the average citizen or extra motivated citizen do to oppose the proposed expansion of nuclear power?
John, do you want to go at this?
Say it again.
I think Ramona gave me an opening there.
Yeah.
I've been really pleased that a group of teachers in Chicago that have used the film in actually middle school as well as high school classes and have written a curriculum for use of the film for teachers, and it is available for teachers. Go on my website. But I have a particular interest in making materials available to K through 12 classrooms, but also at the college level, because the young people have been very seduced by this industry, and it's fantasy machine. And I think having also discussions where students can also bring up their fears around the climate crisis, as well as acknowledging, how scary it is for young people, but that there are many people here and elsewhere in the world that are looking for different paths out of this tremendous crisis we're in. Part of what I loved about Ramana's interview that we include in the film was there are many things we need to change about how we do things, and how we produce energy is one. But I think maybe as a psychologist, I've been particularly interested in opening up space for young people to not just get a barrage of counterfactual information that's based on truth and reality, but acknowledging their fears, and how when we're afraid and in a crisis situation, we're particularly vulnerable to hustles of various kinds. And I think acknowledging that has been really important for me as an educator working with the medium of the film.
So as an organizer for 25 years, and one that has been an organizer for the Sierra Club, I would suggest to, if you're not already a member of the Sierra Club, to join your Sierra Club, your local chapter of the Sierra Club. Sierra Club has always been anti-nuclear from the get-go. And Don Safer and I and the nuclear free team of the Sierra Club, a year ago, we put a resolution before the Council of Club Leaders that asked the Sierra Club to reaffirm its opposition to nuclear power fission and to ramp up its opposition to nuclear power. It passed the Council of Club Leaders and then was passed on to the National Board of Directors. And then they sent it to out to study for a board level committee to study it. They passed it unanimously. The Conservation Policy Committee, they passed it unanimously in March, and then it sent it back in May for the board to vote on it. May of this year, the National Board of the Sierra Club voted unanimously to endorse our resolution that said that the Sierra Club should reaffirm its opposition to nuclear power and to ramp up its opposition to nuclear power. And that means that Sierra Club at all levels, your local group, your state chapter, and the National Sierra Club is going to fight nuclear power. Now, we don't have a lot of money to do that because we don't have a national campaign, but we would ask you to join us, the nuclear free team of the Sierra Club. Ann has joined us as the filmmaker. Some of the co-producers of the film, Catherine Chuddy has joined us, and our team, our steering committee. We're going to try to do this as grassroots organizers because we don't have any money. The charm offensive that the nuclear campaign has, they have the money. We have to fight back with grassroots organizing. And what I would ask, and it was a great question, Don, and whoever gave it to us, is really, it's a softball, and it put it right into my wheelhouse. This is what we need to do, is that we need to work on every chapter in every state in this country, because these SMR proposals are coming everywhere in the country. Now, they started and they're a little bit more advanced, these proposals probably in the West, maybe in Utah and Idaho and a few other places, but they're coming everywhere. The TVA, they're coming to Indiana, to Michigan, to Iowa. They're coming everywhere. And if you haven't seen them yet, you will in the very near future, because the money is out there. The federal government is made available, and it's just there's too much money on the table for these utilities to say no to. And so they will grab the money and they will try to spend it on small modular reactors. They will grab the money and try to open up an existing reactor and say we need it for data centers, we need it for AI, we need it for electric vehicles, for electrification. They will lie and they will lie and they will lie, and they will do anything they can to promote nuclear power in this false renaissance of nuclear power, this atomic bamboozle that Jan has so eloquently said. And I think we're just about at time. And I think what we should do now is go around and everybody give kind of some concluding thoughts on for the evening. And I think maybe we should maybe go in reverse order as we started. So let's go, Mark Jacobson, why don't you give us some concluding thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having us organizing this, Mike. As I mentioned, I think we have the solution to the problem, a solution to the problems of global warming, air pollution, energy security. They're at our fingertips: wind, solar, geothermal, some hydroelectric, batteries, electrification, electric vehicles, heat pumps, electric induction cooktops, energy efficiency, weatherizing your home, more insulation. The things that are obvious are the things that work. We should focus on those and not get distracted by these non-solutions that are driven by these people who really don't have an interest and had no history of an interest in solving the climate, air pollution, and energy security problems the world faces.
Okay, thank you. We lost David at the 90-minute mark. So Ramana, your turn.
Sure. First, I wanted to say that there are an incredible set of questions out there. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the time to actually answer all of them, but I have been, to the extent I can, answering some of them. And so you'll have to look at the answered tab on the questions for those people who did post them. Some of them have been answered there. So please look at that. The other thing I want to say is that it's easy to get overwhelmed and depressed at seeing all this nonsense that we're seeing, but it's worth remembering that the facts are still on our side, right? They have not managed to build a nuclear power plant on budget, within the kind of time frame they're talking about, they being the nuclear industry. The reason they have to do all the song and dance and all this PR work and all this lobbying is precisely because they can't just do what Mark, for example, is suggesting, which is put up a solar panel. The solar panel people don't have to do all this work, right? This political work that the nuclear industry has to do. So that's something to remember. And all of the other problems associated with it, including in particular, the challenge of dealing with radioactive waste is still out there, right? And so I think it's a question of just waiting it out. We have heard this kind of talk about a nuclear renaissance in the past. It has not come to light. It is not going to happen this time again. I think it's just impossible for them to be able to do this. But it's precisely because it is their last chance almost that they are desperate, right? Another 10, 15 years, we would probably have a much larger fraction of renewables. Nuclear power will make absolutely no sense. So they are really desperate at this point. And so you can expect them to open up all the stops and do whatever they can.
Thank you, Ramana. Kathy, how about some closing thoughts?
Well, I am going to go back out and look at the beautiful Pacific Ocean and think good thoughts of all of you folks and wish you a wonderful evening. I had the opportunity to go to New York with my daughter, Morning Rose, during the Great Climate March, and it was a wonderful opportunity. I got to stay in Harlem with some Code Pink ladies, and that was the first time I saw the motto of Kong. That was Kong. And Kong was for against the coal and the oil and the nuclear and the gas. And somehow we had dropped the nuclear. When I came back home to the Northwest, I'm like sitting at the table with some of my friends, and I'm like, we got to pick up that ball because that's a big ball. So it was really, I'm really happy Sierra Club picked that ball back up. So thank you. Thank you to your team. And thank you to everyone doing the good work. Aye, Katsiaya, Kwali Sum, we're still here.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for being with us. Jan, bless you, bless you, bless you. Here for some final thoughts, Jan.
Well, one important Indigenous value around environmental justice that I've tried to take into all of my recent film projects, including this one, is it's important to expose the lies and the destructive reasoning of these industries and their lethal habits and driving interests, but also to hold on to a love of the world that we still inhabit. And people have been able to do incredible things, including in this movement itself, that history and to draw on that history. So in Atomic Bamboozle, I tried to make the Columbia River a kind of character in the film. People talk about the beauty of it, and is this a good way to use the water with these nuclear facilities? I was able to go to the Hanford site and get a sense of the beauty of that place in spite of the horrific legacy of the nuclear projects there, the atomic projects there. And to keep in mind that there's a lot we have throughout history fought to protect. Indigenous people have led the way in a lot of these fights to protect resources from these industries. So I think for me, it's been about these partnerships and coming together with other groups who have the public interest and the welfare of other beings on this planet as well. So I encourage people to see the film and reach out to me personally or on our website if you want to make use of it in your community after this month. And thanks so much to you and the Sierra Club for this fabulous series.
Thank you, Jan. It's actually been a pleasure to work with you. You helped us on actually all the way through the entire series. Wanted to thank you personally for all the help that you've given us through this series. We actually showed your movie last fall when we were trying to pass the resolution. We showed it to a lot of the people that were going to be voting on our CCL resolution. So I'd like to thank you for working with us for over a year on this project. I'd like to thank all of our panelists this evening, Kathy Sampson-Cruzy, MV Romana, David Slissel, Mark Z. Jacobson. I'd like to thank our crew that we couldn't have done this without. Don Safer did a hell of a job, my co-chair, but he handled so deftly the Q&A portion of this and monitoring that Q&A box. And then Catherine Chuddy and also Donald Payne for kind of helping us on the back end of this. I'd like to thank the 112 people that joined us tonight. We got to a lot of your questions. We couldn't get to them all. We'll be sending out the recording of this if you signed up. We would love to continue to hear from you. This is going to take a village. We can't do this alone. We would love your help. We'd love you to help, to join the Sierra Club, join our team. This is gonna take a lot of us to do. We need to spread the word. This is gonna be a grassroots effort. I am just always awed at some of the people that I get to work with, and one of them, and he wasn't here tonight, but I've had the pleasure of working with a guy named Amory Lovins over the years, and I've always thought about something he said a long time ago that I've always thought of about nuclear power. And he once said that nuclear power is the most expensive and dangerous way mankind has ever thought of to boil water. And when you think about that, it really is, it's just so silly that we're just boiling water with nuclear power. And mankind should be able to find a better way to do it. And I think Mark Jacobson's books and Romana's books and these movies show us that we can do that. And so these are great educational ways that I've always used as an organizer to get the word out, because sometimes I'm not the most eloquent speaker, but sometimes reading these books and showing these movies, those are great tools that we can use as organizers. And I will continue to use great film like Jan did, and these other films that we use like SOS and The Women of 3 Mile Island, and the books by Mark Jacobson and by Ramana. And so I encourage people to get those books and to read them and to educate yourself. So you can educate yourself first, and then your family, your friends, and your coworkers, and then your elected officials, because we're in the education business. And what you really need to do is you need to educate your elected officials that this is an atomic bamboozle, that they're fleecing the taxpayers and they're fleecing the ratepayers, and then it needs to stop. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. We've recorded this. Within a few weeks, you should be getting the recordings. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I wish you a blessed evening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of your fall, the rest of your year, excuse me. Bless you. Good night.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.